Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us at our live panel discussion on analyzing racial inequalities in the water and wastewater industry. My name is Marina Fernandez, and I'm a project manager at Ty& Bond. I'm also the chair of the newly formed Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at NUIA. Before we begin, I just want to remind everyone that training technical hours will be available for Massachusetts operators to earn. This panel session has been in the making since May of this year, when a few of us saw the killing of George Floyd and felt passionate to explore and write about racial inequalities in the water and wastewater industry. That in turn sparked the idea to host this panel discussion at the annual conference today. As the nation further awakens to systemic racism, members of the water and wastewater industry must actively identify opportunities to build a more inclusive environment for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC. While we acknowledge that systemic racism is also a reality felt by other racial minorities, this panel will focus on the issues surrounding BIPOC community and hopefully will serve as a starting point for additional discussions around diversity and equality. We invite you to critically think about how you can use your power or position to affect change. What can you and your organization do? What would promote equity, justice, and mobilize meaningful change? Whether you're a senior or a junior leader, how can you advocate for such actions? Leaders at every level must use their power, platforms, and resources to help employees and communities overcome these challenges and build a better world for all of us. With that, I will turn over to our panel moderator, Mr. O.J. McFoy, General Manager of the Buffalo Sewer Authority, who was also our keynote speaker earlier today and so inspiringly spoke about intentionally changing the face of the workforce. Thank
Marina,
you.
thank you very much. I'm just delighted to be here today, even with the Buffalo Bills jokes that I've been receiving all morning or all afternoon. But really, we really wanted to dive in to this discussion again. Earlier we spoke about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some of the things that we're doing here in the city of Buffalo. But now we have together a wealth of knowledge of national experts who have really been focused in on this space in their respective places throughout the country. So as indicated in the program, this Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Forum, it aims to foster a thoughtful dialogue around racial inequalities in the water sector. So what we're going to do, without further ado, I really just want to start off by thanking you, Marina, and your task force, especially Isabella, Jennifer Lawrence, Michael, and all his jokes, Stephen King, Jordan, and Nick Tooker. And Nick, hey, looking forward to you, getting that over the edge on the PhD. So it'd be a great opportunity tomorrow. So hopefully you can add some of this stuff to your dissertation here. But I wanted to make sure that we introduced our national panel of experts. So I'm just going to go through their names, and then we're going to queue it up with them. So we have Nikita Lingenfelter from Nevada DEP, and she also serves as the chair of West House of Delegates. And then we have Ifetayo Venner from Arcadis, who serves on the WEF Board of Trustees. And then we have from my own home state, Stephen Sanders, who's the director head trainer at the Environmental Training Center at SUNY Morrisville. And we have Rachel Gilbert, who's a principal at Woodard and Curran. So with that, I want to have each of you kind of maybe introduce yourself, talk about your current role, and tell us why DE&I is important to you. I'll get started with Nikita.
Thank you so much, OJ, and thank you everybody for having me speak today. This is such an important topic, and I'm so happy to be here. So as mentioned, I am Nikita Lingenfelter, speaker for the House of Delegates for the Water Environment Federation, WEF. And there are approximately 116 delegates, and we represent member associations from around the world. Actually, as I stepped into my speaker role, I realized that most global member associations have no representation, and almost zero underrepresented groups have representation inside the House of Delegates. So we are currently in the process of making change to ensure that we have representation from those global groups and from underrepresented groups inside of WEF. But just a little bit about myself. I started interning for the state of Nevada, the Nevada Division of Environmental Protection, back many years ago while I was getting my chemical engineering degree. OJ, I think this was before you were born, but I still work from them today. And I started in air pollution control. I moved over to water pollution, and now I currently supervise the Bureau of Federal Facilities. So I'm back to my chemical engineering roots. And my pathway into WEF and to the Nevada Water Environment Association was very, very intentional. There is a past president of WEF that saw the need for more diversity in WEF leadership and needed someone that had a strong voice and someone doesn't just sit back and talk and just think about things, but actually we put our words into actions. And so I was recruited as a delegate, and here I am today as Speaker of the House of Delegates. And honestly, this is why we're all here today. We need to be intentional when it comes to DE&I. We need to talk about it, but we can talk about it all we want. But if we don't start taking action and actively trying to make changes, nothing will move forward. So with that, I will give it back to OJ. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nikita. Next, we will have Ifetayo Venner. If you could introduce yourself and tell us why DE&I is important to you.
Sure, thank you, OJ. So my name is Ifetayo Venner. I'm a wastewater service line leader with Arcadis in Tampa, Florida. Although I started my career in New York and my first member association was NUIA. So it's really nice to essentially be back, unfortunately not in person, but maybe some other time. My passion has been water and wastewater. And I think when I started in the sector, and I remember walking into my first conference and having grown up in a country that was majority Black and gone to universities that were pretty multicultural, walking into my new job and walking into the water sector, I almost walked back out. I wondered, not necessarily seeing folks who looked like me or the folks that I grew up with, I wondered, was there a place for me here? Was there a path for me to move forward? Because you don't necessarily see yourself there. And I'm really happy that I pushed past that, both within NUIA and then within WEF, but also within the sector and enabled. But that has kind of, that stuck with me. And so when I see what DE&I means for me, now I'm a little bit higher within my company or within the federation and the sector, making sure that others from other underrepresented and other underserved groups do not come in and then walk back out, right? Or do not see themselves here and have a path towards leadership. Because I think without those voices, especially as we talk about equity and some of the services that we provide, without those voices, we don't offer as sustainable or optimal services as we could do. So that's why it's become, especially over the last few years, a huge passion of mine, and bringing in more folks and more voices into the sector.
All right, thank you very much, Ifetayo. Now we'll ask Stephen the same question. Could please tell us a little bit about your current role and why DE&I is important to you, Steve?
So yeah, my current role is I instruct operators. I'm also was very instrumental with starting our own DE&I task force for NIWEA, and now we've become a committee. I was the chair of that, and also part of the WEF task force for DE&I, and now part of the subcommittee. One of the things that I just think is very important, and it's a chance for us to really take advantage, is I see opportunity. I think about what even what Ify just said, as far as you walk in a room and you feel like you don't belong. There's a lot of folks that are extremely talented that perhaps won't get the opportunity if we don't actually have these discussions. And so with diversity, equity, and inclusion, I just think it's extremely important that we offer the opportunity to other folks and also listen to them as far as what they need to have an inclusive environment to actually thrive. And the events that happened in 2020 with George Floyd and everything else only amplifies the need that we actually have to do this.
Thank you, Stephen. And last but not least, Rachel, if you can give us a little piece about your current role and tell us why DE&I is important to you?
Thank you. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for having me here. I feel very honored to be part of this impressive panel. So again, my name is Rachel Gilbert, and I am currently the manager of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Woodard and Curran. And for those who don't know Woodard and Curran, it is an integrated engineering, science, and operations consulting firm, privately held. So I'll get into my personal statement of why diversity, equity, inclusion. I'd like to think it's from my why stems from my lived experiences. So I have often thought of myself as a child of diversity, and I came to this country when I was 2. I was adopted into a multiracial family, and as an Asian American immigrant, definitely had feelings throughout my life in certain situations of being part of the out group and having a little, just, a little sense of belonging. So I've also had the unfortunate experience of being the target of racism in its many ugly forms, prejudice, stereotypes, and microaggressions. So my why is really grounded in the belief that although we are all connected by our humanity, we are also individuals who deserve the same opportunity to become the best version of ourselves. And with that, I will back to you, OJ.
All right, Rachel, thank you very much. Now, guys, we have, what do we have? About an hour left, and we want to make sure that this is a fruitful hour. So we have some questions, and I have some questions kind of written down that, maybe some surprises that we'll pitch out to our forum here, but we want to make sure that we hear from you. So if you could reach into the chat room and type in some of your questions, we can get those questions out to them as well. So hopefully no softballs, maybe some fastballs, but we're looking for questions from you. So I'd like to kind of get it started. One of the things that was brought up, and I'm going to start with Nikita. Nikita, you mentioned about being intentional. So, intentional is a big piece of this. So what are some examples, maybe some of the barriers that Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks face in the term, in their pursuit of working in the water sector? What are some of those things that may exist that we are not in the water sector being intentional about dispelling? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, so when you say barriers, I think we should all keep in mind that there's internal barriers within ourselves, as Ifetayo mentioned, walking into a new workplace, walking into a new field, and not seeing anyone else that looks like you. So you yourself are going to take a step back and assess, is this a place for me? Should I be here? What are people going to think of me? I don't know if I have a path here or a path to leadership, looking at everybody around me. So you have that mental block of barriers, but you also have the external barriers, the ones that exist in a workplace that maybe those leaders and those managers don't realize, or maybe some realize they may be there, but most don't realize that are there, that truly are there. For example, for where I work, you need a security clearance, and to get a security clearance and just knowing the background and having to have good credit and possibly going to a good school, things like that, things that people don't think about in higher management. And when you're a person of color, you don't have always the best of credit. You sometimes have to pay for school, you have debt, you have other things, there's a lot going on. And to really get into a management level or higher position and getting that clearance too for a person of color, I honestly have never seen another person of color where I am and where I work and the clearance that you need to have. It's just me. And so those are things we can't change. We can talk about it, but there are just many things out there that we see that they're external, but you can talk about it, you can make changes, and you just don't realize they're there, but there are roadblocks there. And we need to figure out ways how to jump over those roadblocks or overcome those roadblocks. And internally, you really need to, I've always been underrepresented. I've always been a minority. I went to a very white schools growing up, the only Black person in my schools. In college, the only Black person in chemical engineering at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the state of Nevada, where we don't have many Black people at all. So I'm used to that. I can walk into a room and be okay with being the only Black person. That's all I know, honestly. So I strive in that environment. I tell my girls, we were meant to be different. We need to be different. That is what makes us all great, is being different. And because you don't don't look like someone, that makes it even better. That's a chance to get to know them and make it work. And so we just need to figure out ways and just internally, externally, just find ways to overcome your barriers, to talk about it, and just to really get around them and not let there be a barrier. Don't let that happen. Just overcome it.
Thanks.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that really makes sense. I mean, you mentioned, roadblocks. You also, you spoke about being one of one. And I think many of us in this forum find ourselves in that situation many, many times. So when we open the next door and you're the first of, it's not a big deal. And it's a big deal to everyone else, maybe. But to you, it's like, yeah, I expect, unfortunately. So we really have to, not only are we paving the way in many cases, but sometimes we have to be the ones that are breaking down some of the roadblocks, some of the barriers, and we can't do that alone. We need everyone in the water sector to kind of do that. So with that, I'll kind of jump into the next set of questions, which would be, what are some maybe structural or policy changes that could be made in your particular field in the water sector? So I'll start with, say, Stephen, and I'll say, what are some of this, structural or policy changes that are ensuring roadblocks now that could be changed or are being changed in workforce areas in higher ed? Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, and I think about workforce, and I go back to one of the things that Nikita brought out as far as being intentional and deliberate. I think we have to really understand what diversity, equity, inclusion actually means. Diversity is easy. Hire people who don't look like you. Hire people who are not like you. But then it has to be managed. What happens now, diversity is going to create friction. One of my big things that I like to talk about is, how do you manage that cognitive friction? You can benefit from that, or it can backfire on you. You take a rubber band, it has no energy, but you create that friction and now you let it go and now it can soar. If you go too far, it's going to break. If you don't do nothing, you go nowhere. So how do you manage that cognitive friction? How do you actually manage diversity in the workplace to actually attain equity? And if we understand what equity means, we understand that different people are coming from different starting points. It's not a matter of, let's just create opportunity. If you wanted me and Usain Bolt to cross the finish line at a 100-yard dash, I have the opportunity. Chances are I'm not going to cross the finish line with him at the same time. I'm going to need a little bit more help. So opportunity is not enough. And the other part of that is the first part, we go through what we went through in 2020 and Black Lives Matter. That's awareness. That's the first step. Let's just be aware that it exists. But we have to go beyond that. What's after awareness? And I think one of the things we have to really pay attention to, again, is culture. And I like to go back to, there was a couple studies done by Berkeley and Harvard and the University of Minnesota. They looked at over 800 different companies that had diversity training. And what they found is that they mentioned that there was no successful impact of this diversity training because everyone basically was more concerned with how not to get sued and what to say and what not to say. And they stopped talking amongst themselves, and these programs failed. The other thing I like to point to too is looking at the merger of Daimler Chrysler. You had two amazing companies that merged together, and when they merged together, their net worth was somewhere around $100 billion. Now on the surface, they look the same. You got white men over here, you got white men over here. But what happened is that they got into this merger, and you had those from Germany and those from the United States were so afraid of offending each other that the company imploded because the culture was not one where they can actually speak back and forth and actually manage that cognitive friction. They can actually manage the diversity. So 3 years later, the company sold for half of what they merged for. So I just think it's important for, those who are in these positions and leadership and everything else to be deliberate, yes, in your hiring practices, be deliberate and asking those what they need to have success. Be willing to listen to others. I have it hanging on my wall. It's what you learn after you know it all that counts. That's a famous quote from John Wooden. Sometimes leaders get into a position, they feel like they have to know all the answers. You don't. Success for certain people might mean different things. What they need to be successful, what they need in an inclusive environment might mean different things. So be humble enough to actually talk to individuals and actually find out what they need to be successful. And get over the mindset of, well, if I do that, I'm showing that I don't know everything. That's okay. And if I do that, am I showing favoritism versus am I helping somebody out? Studies have shown if you have a more diverse group, you're going to get better results. So be deliberate in our hiring practices, be deliberate in creating a culture that is inclusive. I mean, diversity is easy. We can hire different people that don't look like each other, but creating that environment that is inclusive where people can thrive and listening to them, because that's going to be different from group to group to group, to person to person to person. And sometimes we can get ahead of ourselves and not want to listen because we feel like we're in a position that we should know all the answers. And it's just one of those things that I just think is very important that, right now at this time, we have the awareness, everyone knows, yes, there's problems, systemic racism, but are we listening? What do people need to be successful? And how do we create that equity? And really understand what equity means. We're starting from different standpoints, starting from different starting points, and really let that be our goal. Opportunity is not enough. We actually have to do more than just create opportunity.
I love that.
Okay, can I react to a statement that my good friend Stephen has said a couple of times, which is diversity?
Absolutely, floor is yours.
I would say that it's not, at least as far as a sector, and certainly in the STEM field, I would argue that it's not that easy, especially in those higher paying jobs. We've talked about diversity and wanting more diversity for quite some time. We've done a lot of training, but if you actually go back and look at the numbers for the sector or within engineering and a lot of those science-based fields, over the years, it hasn't changed, right? And as a sector, we're still only about 15% women. And if you look at the jobs that require undergraduate or higher degrees and are higher paying jobs, it is very few people of color, especially from the Black and Latinx community. And so I think going back to something Nikita said earlier, I think we have to be a lot less talk, more intentional about what we do in terms of actively trying to bring people in the sector, but understanding what are those barriers? Why are they so few? Why are they not staying? Even within my company, for instance, we are recruiting at a higher rate, but are we seeing those moving up to leadership? Is it equitable? Are the persons of color in roles that are higher paying or more influential within the water sector? I think those are some of the things we have to look at if we really want to move the needle, a little bit more than just talking about it.
Ifetayo, you just spoke about the private sector and your particular company. Maybe I'll open up the floor again to Rachel as well. And Rachel, you serve in a unique role within your company where this is your job. Right, you've traded in your engineering, calculator and everything else, and you've moved over here and you have a new set of calculators. So, can you speak to us about some of the structural, maybe the policy changes that you see on the horizon, or maybe that you guys have made to address racial inequities?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I have been in the engineering world as a practicing engineer for over 20 years, and I really only recently stepped into this new role, and I'm really happy to be here. I did start DE&I work back in 2015 when the company really started to have an awareness around it, as we've mentioned before, and then we moved into awareness, attitude, and then action, right? That takes a little bit of time. So in 2017, I accepted the chair position of the overarching DEI advisory committee. All this obviously being my volunteer position, still doing projects and still being a full-time project manager. And then, of course, in 2020, I had a great conversation with our CEO, and we agreed that it was really time to move into a full investment of DE&I. And I agree 100% with my colleagues here that you can only talk about it for so long before you have to take some action and really, invest in moving that needle. So I was really happy to take my years of engineering and the experience around that and my technical hat I can still use that hand in hand with what I do with DE&I. One of the wonderful things about being a project manager for all those years is that I really know how to get stuff done. That's the one thing that you learn of 10 years of managing projects, and really you're managing people, right? It's projects, but it's people, and that's what really drove me to want to do well in my project management role, was working with clients and working with fellow employees and that sort of thing. I think that getting started, it's every 3 years, we sort of have this, we get to relook at what, look behind, see what we've done, and then stop and say, okay, what worked, what didn't work? And then this, with 2020, and stepping into this role, it was really good timing because we had sort of a 3-year strategy back in 2015 when we hired a DE&I consultant. And now that I'm in this role, it's time to revisit that, right? And look at that 3-year strategy again. And so we've made progress there, which is really putting my resources and reading lots of books. One of the books that I really used in the 3-year strategy that I'm moving forward now is Howard Ross's Reinventing Diversity, and that's very action oriented. And what it's saying is question every single aspect of your company, question every level, go all the way out into the farther reaches of the organization, and ask those questions to see where you're falling short, because the way to move the needle is really to know where you are and where you have your blind spots. And I won't get into the details of the 3-year strategy, but it does, there are lots of things to do. We are certainly at the beginning of that, but we have broken it out into 1-year action plans. And so we just approved the strategy and the action items for 2021, and then we'll continue. So hopefully we can realize our vision in 2023.
Rachel, that sounds great. The fact that you guys have a plan, you've been invested in this, heartfelt for a minimum of 3 years. You have a dedicated individual, and you are treating this like a problem, right? Engineers solve problems. I said that earlier. We teach all of our children, engineers. That's what we do. We solve problems, and this is a problem. This is a stark problem that sits right in our face. And what are we doing to solve it? So hearing those things are great, especially in the private sector. What I'd also like to get a piece of it, from the public sector. Maybe Nikita, if you can touch on that, maybe some of the policy changes, maybe some things that you guys are doing in Nevada from a public standpoint.
Yes, thank you, absolutely. And so here in Nevada, when we talk about the role of the workforce and what water treatment plants and other places can do to really start thinking about diversity and really getting out there and promoting it, honestly, it starts in the schools. I don't want to be doom and gloom and say it's too late for us. It's too late for that silver tsunami. It needs to take place in the schools, and high school, it's kind of too late, starting elementary, middle school. And so I know for the main job of a plan is to really just treat water, but you really need to go take a step further. You need to be active and be engaged in the community. So going out there, giving presentations at schools, letting them know if college maybe and not being a doctor is not the career path for you, this is a good place to be, and not going to those schools. I don't know how to put this nice, but just going to those inner city schools, let's just say, and really truly trying to get to those kids and getting to them at a young age, saying, you have a fabulous career path in water. Here in Vegas, it's a little tough because you could be a valet and make $100,000 a year, but truly in other communities, that is a great career path, and starting young and just letting them know, we need you in this industry. We would love to have you here, and inviting them to it, teaching them about water, giving them tours of treatment plants. It all starts at a young age and starting there in the schools and during the outreach. I know managers want to say, well, you're only here for work hours, you have to work. But if we can truly get people in leadership positions that say we need to do more for our community and we need to do more to bring in diversity and bring in new people into the industry. So let's go to the schools and start giving talks. It all starts there. We have to be, here's the key word of the day, intentional about it. We absolutely have to be intentional about it. And being in a position to make sure that you have power to be intentional. And if you can do it, then let's do it. Let's get it going.
Love it, love it, love it. Yeah.
OJ, can I echo something that Nikita said that I thought was really, really good?
Absolutely, sir. Open forum.
As far as reaching out, as far as that public outreach to the young people, this is a challenge that I throw out to everyone who perhaps comes from a underrepresented group. A lot of times you can go into an underrepresented school, a minority school, or this, that, and the other, but if those kids don't identify with the person, it's kind of, there's a disconnect. So if you are from an underrepresented group and you are in a position to do some of this outreach, man, I put it upon you to actually do that so that those kids who sitting in those seats can actually identify with you and say, hey, he came from a background like me, she came from a background like me, and I can actually do this in this field. Because, you know, you can have someone come in and talk all this great stuff, but if the kids don't identify with them, there's going to be a disconnect. So by all means, my challenge is if you come from an underrepresented group and you're in that position, put yourself in that position to be available for that.
Yeah, and to build on what Nikita and Stephen have said, I absolutely agree with what they said. I think taking it a step further, as we do outreach, yes, I think it is partly on our folks because it is more comfortable for some of those folks from those groups to see and speak to people who they feel understand them and get them. But it is a shared problem. It has to be a shared solution. I think as we're talking about going out and recruiting, and a lot of people are talking about going to different places and recruiting, you can't just show up and expect that they're going to come, right? You've got to build that relationship. You have to do it through sectors that aren't necessarily your network, right? Because I think a lot of the water sector, we don't talk about ourselves as much, so we're not as much in the public. A lot of the people who've come to the water sector maybe accidentally, or they know people, they've been exposed. So a lot of times you will end up bringing a lot of people who kind of look the same, right? That's why our numbers haven't really changed that much. We haven't bring more folks in. So we have to look beyond what our existing networks are, right? I think one of the things that we did when we were working with Howard in the Inflow program was even the students that had an environmental and a sustainability interest, they had no clue what kind of careers were available in water because we never went to them, right? We never went to a lot of the NESBI groups as a sector in general. And so making, when we walked them through WEFTEC, the comment that kept coming back all the time was, I had absolutely no idea these jobs existed, right? The only people we see are construction. So we know to go into civil, but structural. We don't know about water. And a lot of those students, especially from the first cohort that have graduated, they're now at utilities, they're now at consulting firms and so on we're probably not going to go into water in the first place because we essentially ignored those groups, right? So if we want to bring more folks in, we have to look where we haven't looked, but it can't just be transactional. We've got to start that relationship so that they continue to see us and see the sector and have that network to come in and then succeed.
Ifetayo, I'm going to jump in because you committed one of our greatest engineering sins. You just threw out a bunch of acronyms that I want you to explain to everybody who may not know what Inflow and NESBI are, if you would.
Sure. So, well, NESBI is the National Society of Black Engineers, and incidentally, that's the organization that I was a part of when I was in school, and that's actually how I found my job with Arcadis through NESBI, a NESBI meeting, and somebody from Malcolm Prenny at the time showed up and was talking about water. And up until that point, I don't think I knew. I think I had an interest in water, but I didn't know what these jobs were either. That was just not what I heard about. And I heard him speak, and it was actually a Black man as well. And I thought, wow, that's exactly what I think I wanted to do, but I've never quite heard it articulated like that. I had no idea that a career existed. And so that was essentially, the rest was history. I've been at Arcadis for the last 20 years now. As far as Inflow, that is a WEF initiative that we started about 3 years ago. It's introducing future leaders to opportunities in water. And so it's got 2 tracks, a STEM path track and a career tech track. The STEM path track is for underrepresented racial minority groups and bringing them into the sector, racial and ethnic minority groups. So focusing on Black, Latinx, and Native American indigenous communities within the US that are historically underrepresented in our sector. And then underserved groups, so folks who have barriers to employment are usually served in our career tech track. So that's been going on at WEF Tech for the last 3 years, and then some member associations have also incorporated that within their programming as well.
All right. So yeah, thank you very much for that. So I want to encourage everybody again, this is a forum, and so if you can submit questions to the chat, we'll make sure to get those off. And with that, we'll start with our first question that's come in from the chat. And it focuses in on particular organizations, or how would somebody go about connecting with K-12 as a practicing engineer. Maybe I'll toss that up to Rachel first on this one.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to echo everything the panelists have said regarding that kind of early education involvement. And the private sector really is no different than the public sector in terms of our role in trying to bring in more industry professionals. One of the reasons we don't see more people of color in our industry is that STEM exposure and opportunities are really heavily skewed towards people of privilege, and particularly at that intersection of race and class. So the importance of really starting young is I can't stress that enough. Now how do you do that? I feel like the best way to perform that outreach, and this is some of the stuff that I'm talking about in the years coming ahead, is to have that greater outreach. And when I say outreach to underserved communities, it's not just going in and talking to the schools. It's literally investing through scholarships, through sponsorships, mentoring programs, because these underserved communities, they simply don't have the resources. So they're going to need the investment in those resources to be able to bring those people into the world of STEM. And so I think that's another area we have to be extremely deliberate. We have to find partnerships, and I think it really starts at the local level. So that's part of the work that I'm trying to do now is really looking, because we are coast to coast, where can we partner with local underserved communities and really have that be an investment from the ground up at those young ages.
OJ, can I step in too and just let everyone know what we're doing here in Nevada? Thank you. And so what we do for the Nevada Water Environment Association, going out to schools, a big part of our young professional program. It's what they want to do. They want to go and give presentations to the student and let them know about the water industry and the amazing jobs we have in the water industry. And so the first step is, and you would think it would be easy to get into a school and talk to kids, but it is not. You have to call the school, call the principal, call the teachers, but you just have to start at the school, find someone that you connect with, get them a name of a very active teacher. Usually the teacher needs to be active and not so much a big part of the community, but they need to be an active teacher. A lot of teachers, they're busy, so they just don't have time to field calls from us, but it takes a lot of phone calls, a lot of outreach. Call every single school that you can, and that's where it starts, just picking up the phone and calling the school and see if you can get in there and get a presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the times where you really can jump in is, we use like, Water Week or Introduce a Girl to Engineering, or, Imagine a Day Without Water, or simply if they're hosting career days, those are the days you get in there. And it's about developing those relationships. It's not a one-time you show up. It's about developing those relationships and make sure that it's interesting and make sure it's age appropriate. If you're talking to first graders, it needs to be age appropriate, right? For us, we bring our toilet paper, right? If you're talking to, middle schoolers, it's age appropriate. Like, you know, we have our little poopy guy right here. Like, we bring him, we pass them out, and you want to see a second grader, a third grader go, oh my gosh, I got a poopy emoji, like, you know, squish ball. They love it. But it's the connection and what that has to happen to make it happen. And, you know, Nikita, you're right. It is not very easy to get into schools, especially now. And it's going to get worse, I'm sure. But it's imperative that we do that we start early to change the playing field for many of these individuals. So, you know, Ifetayo, you mentioned you were in college and you were visited by a professional who spoke about water. I had a similar experience, right? You know, being the president of the National Society of Black Engineers at my college, which was Clarkson University up in upstate New York. You know, we had a similar thing, but it was always a challenge to ensure that we made those connections with the various firms that were out there. So. So I'd like to get into maybe another question that's come from the chat room, and it focuses in on wastewater operators. So it talks about what are some of the restrictions and maybe some of the challenges that we're finding in recruiting from an operator standpoint. And you know I'm tossing this to you, Steve. So you're first up on this one. Go ahead.
So one of the challenges that we find, I sit on our Operator Certification Governance Council in New York. I teach operators. I see 500 something operators a year. But one of the challenges that we find as far as trying to create diversity within operations is accessibility. I mean, we start talking about operations jobs, is accessibility to civil service exams. Many folks don't know how to apply for these jobs, and it literally can be 2 blocks from their house. And there's job openings that are right there. So that's something that we're working on here in New York with our DE&I committee is how can we create more accessibility for underrepresented groups to actually have this accessibility to these civil service exams, even though they exist. Because I poll all of my students and ask them how they got into this field. And the overwhelming answer is, I knew a guy who knew a guy who knew a guy, and that's how I got in. Or it was my father or my brother or my so-and-so. But we never hear about someone who offered this opportunity as they came out of school because they just didn't know about it. So we have to find a way to make these civil service exams more accessible. We have to find a way to remarket ourselves. I think about, you know, we have the title operator, and I, you know what, we've all got used to that title. We've relabeled our wastewater plants or our sewer plants as water resource recovery facilities. And I wonder if there's a point where we have to look at the operator title. We talk about an operator as a person that we think about, this is a person that operates a piece of machinery. But when you look at our operators, man, they're water specialists. I mean, they do all kinds of different things. And do we need to rebrand ourselves a little bit and create opportunity for people to get in right from the ground floor and not let it be their 3rd, 4th, 5th career opportunity? So I think accessibility is important. And I also think rebranding ourselves as far as operators is also important as well.
And Stephen, related to that accessibility, I know we've had some conversations about reducing some of those barriers to entry in terms of the cost for, you know, a lot of folks coming from underserved communities or you know, some of these underrepresented racial groups, their income or poverty levels may be lower, you know, depending on the region that you're in. And so some of the costs for certification, the training, having mentors who they can ask questions to, it's just not there. And so how can we reduce those barriers to entry so that it is easier for them to participate and get past that first hurdle?
And just to go back, I can connect this with what Nikita was talking about too, is when we start creating these relationships with you know, with education, K through 12, you know, that's also a part of it as well. Do people know that, you know, this is actually out there and available? You know, the mindset of, if they don't know about us, that means we're doing our job. That's over, you know, because the only time that, you know, they hear about operators or operations or wastewater is when we're asking for more money or when there's a problem. You know, how do you view a person that only time you see them is they're asking for more money or there's a problem? You don't view them in a very favorable light. But if we can set the groundwork and have presence in the community and reach out to young people, guess who parents listen to? They listen to their kids. You know, so if we can we can have that presence in the community and reach out to young people, I think that that's going to do that could actually make some very real change.
This relates to barriers too for the HR departments, human resources. When people are applying for these plant jobs, for these operator jobs, they're looking for specific requirements. One of our largest plants here in Nevada, their best operator to date, they had an internship program and they wanted to open the doors to everybody, as it should be at an entry-level operations job. And their best person was previously a museum curator at one of the museums here. They turned out to be the best operators. So I want to say, just having those preconceived notions because someone else did this in their job, because they have some water classes, doesn't mean that they'll make the best operator, or it doesn't mean that we shouldn't take this person over here that worked at this job. Just keeping an open mind and taking in everybody and looking at everybody, that's what's going to make the difference.
Love it, love it. So having some more questions coming in, which we truly appreciate. So here's a question that I'm going to toss out to you guys, and maybe I'll start first with our Water Environment Federation. So being in New York Water Environment, and you know, here we are with NEWIA, we know that WEF is actively involved and actively pursuing this, as well as setting and measuring metrics. So the question that came up was, what metrics are being used to measure the success of diversity, equity, and inclusion? This is for Ife or Nikita. You guys want to jump on that one?
So I will say, on the WEF, while we've been doing stuff right now, I'm not sure that I would say that we have a ton of metrics, although Nikita can probably talk about what we've been measuring in terms of what our member associations are doing as far as where they are on their journey. We right now are in the middle of a strategic planning process, so we also have a consultant on board that is helping us through that process. So one of the things we are doing is we're interviewing, and then we're going to be doing some focus groups and surveys of the wider WEF community. And so that process is underway right now with our consultant and our DE&I subcommittee that Stephen is also a part of. Part of that, I think, is we are looking at what metrics we and the member associations are taking, which is not a lot as it relates to diversity, right? We've done some informal polling from our committees and the board, but one of the things looking forward is what can we add, right? And then I'd say within my own organization, surprisingly, we take a lot. And I think there's probably a lot of groups that, organizations that do take a bit, but it's not very public. And I think some of that sharing is probably very helpful, and we should do more of that to see where we are as a sector and where we're going to. But looking within Arcadis, I was surprised at how much information there is available, but we're not necessarily paying attention to it. So we might look at how many persons do we have, but there's also, as I've learned over the last 3 or 4 months, really digging into this deeper, where we are at every level of the organization in terms of the different types of jobs. Are people of color more likely to do certain jobs than others? Looking at retention, looking at how long, you know, I said they stay within the organization, average salaries, are they participating in our leadership programs as frequently as others? All of those different things, I think, tell a story. But of course, you cannot continue to always be looking at all of that data. You'll get bogged down and as we said, not be able to do a lot of action because you're spending a lot of time on metrics. So I think it's key at the very beginning to really understand where you're at. And I think that's hugely key, to spend some time understanding the problem, but then you need to decide, what am I going to focus on moving forward, and what are the key metrics so that I know that I'm moving in the right direction and how often I need to do that. So I think that's sort of what we're doing within Arcadis. And as I said, I was amazed. Looking through the data, I think we uncovered a lot of things that we're now starting to work on. And that's what we're also in the process of doing for WEF. But still a little bit early on in that journey of strategic planning. So.
All right, good to hear. Nikita, did you want to jump in?
Ifetayo explained that perfectly. We're still in the early steps to establish metrics for the House of Delegates and for member associations. It's about collecting the data. And right now, a lot of member associations don't collect that data. Yeah. And having them collect that data, having them ask tough questions of their membership, just ethnicity. People are going to ask, why are you asking me if I'm Black or white? What does this have to do with anything? So overcoming those barriers and those challenges within the member associations to even collect metrics of any kind is still a work in progress. So as we move forward, we will have more metrics that we'll be looking at and comparing to, but at least sectorally in the House of Delegates, what we're putting in place right now is WEF is considered a global association, but we technically don't have global representation within the House of Delegates. The House of Delegates is the governing body of WEF. It's where we approve presidents, we can remove presidents, we vote on the bylaws. All that was handed to the House of Delegates. And if we don't have equal representation in the House of Delegates, if everyone is not represented, if everyone is not involved who needs to be, who should be there, what are we doing? So we are right now in the process of changing that and making sure that we have that representation, and those metrics are really just looking at the member associations. Who has a member association? Do they have delegates? If not, why not? Let's get them here. Those underrepresented groups, are they represented in the House of Delegates? If not, let's reach out, get them in here. So that's what we're doing in the House of Delegates. We're being very intentional, handpicking those people to make sure they are represented inside of the delegates to voice change and to have change inside of WEF.
All right. Thank you very much, Nikita. That's truly informative. Now, Stephen and I come from NIWEA, and we know that we're just getting off the ground and really getting those metrics. And, Ifetayo, listening to you, you're right. We could get a whole bunch of metrics, but it's about finding those key performance indicators on how we're going to measure our success in that space. So that's still ongoing. But we have to get it done, and we really have to put some effort towards it. So, we're having this forum, we don't have all of the answers, but we are here for the discussion, and we have some of the answers. We have some things that have worked. I know I spoke earlier about some things that worked in Buffalo. And we've brought folks from across the country really to this forum so that we can all get better at what we're doing here, especially as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So next question I have here is a couple of things that we talked about, it not being easy, right? It never being easy in kind of the roles that you have in the organizations that you are in. But what other maybe support or efforts do we envision accomplishing, maybe in the short term, and then maybe we could talk about the long term as well. So maybe I'll start again with Rachel. As it relates to leadership for Black and Indigenous and people of color.
Sure. So I want to make sure I understand the question. It's more focused. Is it more focused on leadership, or is it more focused on kind of recruiting and retention?
It's really going to be focused on leadership, because we know we have the recruiting piece, but I think I want to talk about what are we doing here on the leadership piece, because that finds itself being a problem as well. So, we don't have these like a unicorn. We want to make sure that we have a whole bunch of folks that we're possessing up.
Okay. And so that is a really important discussion topic, because like many of the panelists have said, we can bring in a lot of different people into the organization and have them look different. We can bring in lots of people who look different, but what does it mean if those people aren't being supported in a culture that propels them to the top and being in those leadership positions? And I think that's one of the biggest struggles that a lot of the organizations have, and we know from studies and McKinsey and all that stuff that that diversity at the top, being having higher percentages of people of color and women in those top leadership positions really kicks up the performance of the company to, to much, much higher levels. So what organizations need to ask themselves is really the company culture. And I think we have to ask ourselves some pretty tough questions. Does leadership model inclusive behaviors, and are they being made accountable? Are they talking? How are they talking to their teams? And how are managers? What I'm finding is the biggest barrier in terms of getting people of color to rise to the top are these middle managers. They are not given the tools all the time and the resources and the training to foster psychological safety within their own work teams. And if you don't have that, then that person of color who may be one may not have a voice. And so we really need to give those tools and invest in those resources for our managers so that they can foster that type of environment, and they can promote within and get those folks up to into the ranks that we're talking about in leadership positions. And we need to ask these questions at all levels, because if you're a staff engineer and you're a person of color and you're not seeing a person at the top who looks like you, well, that's a problem. And that person of color is not going to stay in that organization. So we need to ask ourselves tough questions. We need to provide tools. We need to make investments. And that company culture is so key to really making a difference in this area.
Thank you, Rachel. A couple of questions have come in that are kind of near and dear to my heart. Working in New York here in a public utility with union contracts. And the question that came in is, some union policies, in their agreements are promotion is solely based off of seniority. So how can these policies affect recruitment of Black, Indigenous, and people of colors? And how can we use these policies or use these mechanisms to also ensure promotion? So Nikita, I don't know if you guys have kind of union agreements out there, but you are a public utility. Did you want to speak to that?
Well, I work for the state, so it is very different than a public utility. I don't know if I want to throw this one over to Stephen. If he has any.
Steve's looking at me like, nah, you don't want this. Stephen, did you have anything on that one?
Yeah, I before I had this job, I worked in the public utility down in Yonkers, New York, and we had to deal with the whole civil service and all the different policies and everything else that goes along with that. The main thing that I think what we talked about earlier is having people have access to get on a list. You have to take the test to get on a list. And that's just the system that we have set up right now for a lot of public utilities. And so when we start talking about having underrepresented people come into the field, when you're dealing with civil service, they need to have accessibility to the exams. They have to have accessibility to exam resources, and they have to know that they're actually there. And so can we get into these different communities that represent underrepresented groups and actually educate them to what's actually out there and actually how to go about doing it? So many people have no idea, the plant, they can live next door to a plant and they have no idea how to get a job at that plant.
Yeah.
So a lot of it becomes public education as well.
So Stephen, is that a state regulation where you have to take a test to apply for this job? Where is that coming from? Because that is a big barrier, I think.
Yes, that's civil service. That's a state regulation. You have to get on a list. You have to take a test, and OJ can speak to this as well. Coming from a public utility, you only have the top 3 for a position that's reachable, and it's just a whole process. But one of the things that we found is that even on the drinking water side, a lot of people are not aware of all these different things they have to do to actually get into the field. And that's why I mentioned public education as far as, accessibility to these tests, exam materials that they may need to look at. That's definitely a state regulation in New York.
So have you went to the state, have utilities band together and come to the state and say, you know what, this is an issue for us. Can we change these regulations, at least for the entry level, so they can take the test maybe after 6 months after they get the job? So here in Nevada, we don't have that requirement. You can go and you can apply, and then after so many months or so many years, you can then take your test. So has anyone ever petitioned the state and said, you know what, this is hurting us, this is a barrier, is it possible to get removed and put something else in place that will still achieve the goals that you want to achieve, but it's just a different avenue to get there?
Yeah, we're doing that. We're in the process of looking at that right now. As far as NIWEA, New York, Water Environment Association. But there's just this long-standing tradition with civil service that it's really difficult for them to give up. And we have to go through this for different levels as far as different positions. You want to be a supervisor, if you want to be a manager, if you want to be a chief, you still have to get on a list and take a test to be able to do that. And so we are trying to go through that process with the state of New York. I can tell you with the state of New York has been a rough climb. Even during COVID, some people were hired on a probationary basis for a year. And even though they couldn't take a test, they couldn't take a class because we're in the middle of COVID, civil service, we were still dealing with them, and they still were extremely harsh as far as not, laxing their standards a little bit. But it's a process. We're still working with it. If you work on the public side and you're dealing with civil service, I don't know what New England deals with. We'll be glad to share notes, but it's definitely a process that we're still going through.
Yeah, and I think if we're really serious about increasing diversity within our water sector, I think we really have to, as a sector, be very honest about how our network and, not expanding that, but also all of the various barriers that we have, how that is how that is unintentionally creating barriers to entry from these very groups that we're saying that we want to bring in. And, some of it may be necessary, but a lot of it might not be, or if you can get around it. But there's unquestionably a lot of barriers that we've sort of set up, probably for good reasons, but they serve the purpose of keeping out a lot of the people that we spent the last several years saying we want here. And we need, right? Because we talk a lot about our sector. We need people, we need jobs. We have a lot of jobs, we need a lot of people, but yet we're creating barriers to entry for those very people that we want to bring in.
Yeah, absolutely. On that one, we could have a lengthy conversation in what the efforts that we've been doing here in New York State, as far as working with our, our state capitol and working with the Civil Service Division, and all of the concerns that we may have from, from contract stipulations. One of the things that we did here in Buffalo was, and I don't want to take us so far down this rabbit hole, but one of the things we did here in Buffalo was, we recently just brought on 15 wastewater operators. And that wasn't a short process. So to get everyone ready, we actually opened up our own training program. We actually went on the tour of churches and, asked to speak at churches in our underserved communities to say, hey, listen, we have jobs. There is going to be a test that's coming up. And in fact, we're running our own training program to get people ready for these jobs. So we really were intentional about going into the particular neighborhoods where we weren't seeing folks, on our database where they lived at. So we were going into those neighborhoods, those underserved neighborhoods, making sure that they were showing up for the preparation that we were offering. And we feel we're very successful. I mean, we just brought on 15. It is a huge, diverse group. We're bringing on several women, which we haven't had in operations. And, that's one of our missteps. But this group that we just brought on, that we'll be sending soon to you, Stephen, for further training. But it's about finding those ways around and within the system. So we understand that we have, contractual agreements. We understand that we have the civil service, but how do we then make sure that these people are prepared and know about what's going on and the opportunities that are, like you said, maybe right next door to them. So that's one of the things that we've been doing here in Buffalo. So, I applaud you guys as well, Stephen, you understand the challenges with civil service here in the state of New York, and I'm sure they're very similar to what you guys are. We're right next door to each other, and just connected states here. So with that, we're going to go into another question, and then we need to wrap it up really short, because I know we need to make sure that we get the credits. So we have to make sure that we roll the poll questions. So I just want to do the one more question, if we could, and maybe each of you can touch on this briefly. As we acknowledge, structural racial inequalities are intertwined and maybe at the core of the things that we do. If each of you could give me like one thing that the people that are tuned into this forum can do to fight these inequalities, what would it be?
I'm going to say be the voice of change, be the action. Don't think about it, do it. If it takes petitioning the state, going to the state, finding that champion within the state to get some policies removed, to get policies in place, don't just think about it, you have to act on it. I want to say that the most successful people in the world, they set their goals, but they actually go out and try to achieve them. We have to set what we want to do, and we actually have to go out and do it. So don't sit back and watch. Go out and try to make that change.
All right.
I will say be deliberate. Be deliberate with our recruiting, with our hiring practices. Be deliberate with establishing a culture that's inclusive, where people can, underrepresented groups can move up the ladder. Be deliberate with all those different things. Pay attention to culture. Otherwise, you can create diversity, but no one's going to stay. Be deliberate with your culture as well.
I'd say be aware. I could probably say a lot. I have a lot to say on this topic, but one of the things I would encourage is that you be aware within your organization. What are the challenges that your Black, Latinx, et cetera, workers are facing that you may not be aware of, and then how can you help? But you really, without that awareness and understanding of what your central issue is and why what you want to happen is not happening, you can't really move forward and be intentional. And then I think mentoring. I've certainly benefited from that. I've always probably been, at least for the last several years in leadership, the only. I don't want to be the only. I spend a lot of time mentoring, especially women of color. I think I could not understate the importance of mentorship and being, engaged with folks like Nikita and Stephen and establishing that network as well. So if you can be a mentor to someone of color, do that, because I think that has been a key factor in my success as well.
Rachel?
Yes, I also could talk a lot on this one as well. So, but I will let you know one of the. I think there are many things you can do, but one of the things that I'm finding is very impactful in my organization is to start an employee resource group around race and be deliberate about collecting feedback from people of color and allies. And when I say allies, I mean true allies who are self-educating on racial awareness and racial inequities. And, this can range, getting that feedback ranges from interpersonal racism in the form of microaggressions and other behaviors to getting feedback on the larger institutional racism that's embedded in policies and practices. And this is going to be a constant process to understand what these issues are, because it's an ever-changing world. But these issues need to be talked about. The awareness needs to rise all the way up to the top ranks, so leadership, CEO, so that leadership body can evaluate, understand, get that awareness, and then really move to take action to change policies, change procedures.
All right, thank you very much, Rachel. So what I'd like to do right now is I'd like to invite Marina in, and we're gonna do some poll questions. And then after our poll questions, we'll likely come back with maybe a couple of finish up questions. So I give the floor to you.
Thank you, OJ. I just want to ask everybody, there is some training contact hours that are available again. And if you are, that you should be seeing a slide coming up. There you go. If you want to respond to this on directly on the the chat, please do so, and you will receive your training hour credits for Massachusetts operators. So it should be just, why did you attend today's conference? A, technical content, B, educational credits, C, networking, D, other. So I think we have enough time. So with that, OJ, I'm going to be throwing back to you. I do want to let you know, OJ, this has been by far the busiest chat of all the sessions thus far. Lots of great conversation, lots of great questions. So let's keep going. I think we do have some time for a few more questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I thought the poll question was going to be hard. You guys get credit for that. We'll talk about that later. Don't. You should tell New York. That was great. So now we'll continue on with some of the questions that we had. Now, Ifetayo, you brought up mentoring, and I know this was brought up earlier in our discussions as well. That is huge. And what role do you see mentoring playing in your office, in the private sector, maybe at the web level, to ensuring that people who look different than other people actually come into the water sector and they actually stay? And not only do they stay, but they flourish.
I would say a lot, probably even from the beginning, mentoring students that are in high school or in college. I think what that serves is it makes the profession a lot more real to them, more accessible. Certainly, a lot of folks, I think Stephen mentioned that a lot of folks come into the sector because they knew someone. And so if they don't have the opportunity to sort of engage with people in the sector, they're less likely to come in. But then once you get in, because a lot of it is we are the first or we might be the only, a lot of the promotions and all of that, it's not necessarily an exam. And so if you're not familiar with the sector or you don't have that network, it's a little bit hard to figure out, what's the next job and things like that. So mentoring kind of just demystifies things quite a bit and then allows you to understand what is it that you need to succeed. What is available out there. It also, as I said, expanding the network that you have is very important because you get to find out. I think that's what's been so beneficial and I've had lots of mentors, a little bit or not, probably some of them don't even know that they have been mentoring me, but it makes you aware of what's going on, how it is that, what things you need to do to move up, what's going on in the sector. Which does make it easier to sort of move forward and find out what's out there. But I also think there's been times where I've wanted somebody else who sort of had my experience to mentor me, and that also gives you that's a little bit of a different perspective, and it's less isolating. So I think it's both. You need persons who are like you to mentor you, because that is a unique perspective as you sort of navigate your job as a person of color. It's different, especially in an organization that is not organization or sector that's not very diverse. But yeah, I think mentoring is key because I think it demystifies a lot of the sector. And so a lot of people don't succeed or they don't stay because they don't know how to move forward. They don't know the opportunities and a lot of things like that. And that comes through networking and mentoring.
All right, thank you. Does anyone else? Rachel?
I will say something on mentoring. I think it's extremely important. And one of the ways that we've been trying to do that in our organization is we do have an organically grown mentoring program that started in a couple offices and has now spread to all the rest of the offices, and including, of course, we're all remote, but remote employees as well. And it's really just about matching up mentors and mentees. And it's really doing quite well. And what I'm trying to do from a DE&I perspective is to take our 7 employee resource groups and find a way to pair up people of color or people with disabilities, parents and caregivers. Those are some of our resource groups within that company-wide mentoring program. And the program is great. It's 6 conversations in 6 months. There are people who are, they volunteer to be mentors and they're on this list. And then you have people who want to be mentored and they choose their mentor. And it can be anyone within the company. So this is the first year that we've really rolled it out to the entire company, just needing to have that connection during COVID. And it's gone quite well. And I think that we'll continue to do that company-wide. And it's a lot of work to pair up people. But with the way our technology is now, it's seamlessly easy really to get on video and really be paired up with someone you never even met before. And we do try to encourage folks to be paired up with people outside of their business unit. But I think next year will be great to try to get people who are underrepresented voices and people who are, especially people of color, to be paired up with others if that's what they want to do.
And I think for that, it's also important to look outside of your company, because especially at those higher levels, you talk about moving into leadership, it's hard. I know we've struggled with, for our underrepresented racial groups within Arcadis and setting them up with mentoring. They participate at a lower level, because there aren't that many mentors of color at the higher levels, because within our sector, there aren't that many people of color. And so I think the role of the professional organization in that should not be, can't be understated, because there's a lot of employees even within my firm that they don't have any other person of color within their office, and WEF and their member association is where they're able to meet other people from their organization of color and other people in the sector of color to help them with that networking and find those mentors. So I think, NOEA, NIWEA, WEF have an important part to play in that mentoring, because again, so many of these offices and utilities, there aren't that many, especially at those higher levels. And if we want to move them into leadership, we've got to help establish some of those connections.
All right. Nikita or Stephen?
Yes, I just want to say that mentoring is everything. I know Ifetayo said she benefited greatly from mentoring, and so did I. I wouldn't be in the position I'm in without my mentor. And I think all those listening to the call today, you're all very capable and you can all be mentors. Being a mentor is very intentional, finding that person, seeing something in that person, help raising them to the level that you know they could be at. I know it's hard for minorities and just for people in general, just to find the confidence within themselves and say, you know what, I deserve that higher position, I'm gonna go get it. Sometimes it takes that extra person saying you do, and you absolutely have the knowledge, have the power, have everything you need to do to be successful. And it's hard to look at yourself and just say, just tell that to yourself. You need that other person, you need that extra help sometimes. And so I just can't stress enough how important mentoring is and how all of you can be mentors and help that person become the best that they can be, because people really do need help. We won't ask for it, but we do need help.
And interesting fact, like I think Nikita mentioned at the beginning, her mentor, a former WEF past president, who is the reason why she's the speaker-elect and kind of saw that as an attainable position, is also the person who shoved me into the board. And I guess that turned out pretty well. So, again, can't understate the importance of that mentoring and being very intentional and giving people a shove, because sometimes, again, I believe in my abilities, but it's when you don't see people that necessarily look like you, the position isn't as attainable in your head, and sometimes it takes that nudge, and I was very lucky that Rick Warner gave me that nudge, and I will say Nikita is the same, and I think the organization is certainly benefiting from that engagement. So.
And I'll just add, I've been doing this for 20 plus years. I did not have that mentor. So I'm coming from a slightly different perspective. But man, if I did, because there are many times I thought about walking away from this whole thing. So I will throw that out as a challenge to anybody who represents basically an underrepresented group to turn around and reach your hand out to somebody as far as a mentor. I can't say that strong enough. Mentorship is just huge. If you don't see that person that you can identify with, how do you know what's even attainable for who you look like, for what you represent? But that's the challenge that I throw out there. If you come from an underrepresented group, look for somebody that you can turn around and throw your hand out to offer assistance to help them along the way.
Thank you, Stephen. All right, so before I turn this back over to Marina, I just want to throw a Josh Allen fastball at you guys to say, listen, here's a question for you. And this comes up, a lot, right? We've been focusing in on diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do you say? How are you going to equip the person who gets accused that they're playing favoritism in this space? So that'll be our last question of the day, because that's one of those fastballs. So I'll get started. I see my buddy, my head shake is shaking his head. So Stephen, I'm going to get rolling with you, buddy.
And that's something I'm talking about with another group later. All right, so how do I get around not showing favorites, but at the same time trying to create an inclusive environment for different people to thrive? The big thing with that is you have to understand what equity means. Equity means is that we're coming from different starting points. And so different people need different things. I'm not showing favoritism if I want everyone to arrive at the same finish line. I want everyone to arrive at the same finish line. So equity means that is going to be different things I need to do for different people to get them to do that. That's not favoritism. That is a matter of, I care about this person. I want them to fulfill their expectations. I want them to go as far as they actually can go. And that means something different for every single person. And we have to get over that showing favoritism versus understanding equity. And understanding equity is we understand that we're starting from different positions. And so we have to accommodate different ways.
All right.
Yeah, I would argue that by doing nothing, you are showing favoritism, right? Whether it's probably not intentional, but if you're doing nothing, that's exactly what you're doing. I think if you look at most of the organizations in the sector, especially at some, in almost any factor that you can look at, Black employees are probably at the bottom of your list in almost any way that you can look at it, right? Same for other underrepresented groups. So if you're doing nothing, you are in fact showing favoritism. It's how do you level that playing field so that the opportunities are the same, right? The opportunities are there so that everybody can succeed together, because I think it's unquestionable that the organization will be the better for it and the sector will be the better for it. We're talking about, what we do is deliver public services to communities. And if we don't reflect those communities, we're not offering those services optimally, right? We can't be sustainable if we don't do that. So flip that question a little bit on it, a little bit, and ask yourself, what are you doing to change that? So.
Love it. Nikita or Rachel?
Yes, I think Stephen Ifetayo said it perfectly. You have to make sure that equity is there, and then also you have to make sure that that the person, if you're not doing anything, that's a big statement. I talked about this with Ifetayo many times. We always bring this up. Staying quiet, that is a statement. That's a point. That is an intentional act. So just making sure, just looking at what your organization needs, what your association needs. Whatever people that you're looking at to move up or to put in that place, what do you need at this point? Do you need some more of the same or something new? And that's not playing favoritism at all, I don't think, in my book.
All right.
Yeah, I would definitely echo all of those sentiments, and kind of comes back to what I said in my beginning statement about the why, and it really is very individual. If we keep things the same, as Ifetayo said, we really are playing favoritism towards the white privileged group. I mean, that's the dominant culture, and that's the culture that's really been given all of those opportunities from day one. So if we're not moving the bar for each individual person and helping them out and making sure that they can get to the top and get access to those opportunities, then we aren't doing anyone any favors. So yes, equity is very different than equality. And I think that the picture says 1,000 words, the one on the fence when you show it. And I think you probably all know what I mean, but when I see that picture, it makes it so clear to anyone who says, hey, are you playing favorites? No, look at this photo and look at this picture, and what do you see?
Love it. Thank you, Rachel. And with that, I see we are very close on our time, so I didn't want to make sure that we didn't go over, but I definitely want to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you, Nikita, Ifetayo, Stephen, and Rachel. Thank you very much for the knowledge that you've shared today. I know I've learned some things, so I'm going to go try some more stuff over here in Buffalo. And I definitely want to thank Marina and her team of moderators, and for really bringing all of this together, for getting all of these great individuals to be in this forum, in this space right here and right now. I just think it is great. And with that, I will turn this over to Marina. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, OJ. Thank you, Nikita. Thank you, Ifetayo, Rachel, Steve. I also echo OJ's sentiment. I have learned a lot both this morning, earlier this afternoon, actually, and during this panel discussion. I appreciate the time you all took to prepare for this discussion, and also to open your hearts and really be frank around this topic that can be at times challenging and uncomfortable. But that is what change is like. And I hope that by sharing your experience, we can continue to look at ways in which we can foster this change, both in our lives and in our industry as well. I would also like to thank our sponsors for supporting this forum. They are listed over here. Thank you all very much. Thank you, NUIA, for being so welcoming with our ideas to host this forum. I would also like to remind you to check out our latest NUIA journal. You can find a link to the latest issue of NUIA at the NUIA website under the journal repository link, where you will find an article on confronting racial inequalities in the water and wastewater industry. Also, please consider joining the DE&I committee, which is a newly created committee. It meets every first Tuesday of the month, but because of the annual conference this year, our next meeting will be held on Tuesday, March 2nd. If you have any ideas for our committee, please see me or chat with me here. Steve King is also our vice chair. He will be available to answer questions if you have any. And to end our discussion, I would like to wrap up the theme that we've heard thus far as part of this annual conference, which is advocate, act, and be the change, along with the message we heard earlier from this panel, and the message we heard from our moderator, OJ, earlier in his keynote speech, when he called us to change the face of the workplace and bring diversity to the table. I want to wrap all of those ideas up with a beautiful poem that we all by now must have heard from Amanda Gorman at the inauguration, when she said, "For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it." So thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day, and enjoy the conference.